Good morning to everyone. I'm in Colorado, a couple hours ahead of you or earlier than you are. So I'm going to be talking about transceivers and maybe how you pick one and whether you need one or not. So one thing I do want to say, focus on your antenna. If you've got an option, which you may or may not, the antenna is probably the most important thing. So let's look at the big picture and then talk about some rigs that you may want to consider buying, and hopefully you've got some options there at the Hamfest. So are you considering a new HF rig? So it's a subjective decision. So you're going to say, well, what's going to work for me? And I would say it's a fairly complex decision. And what do you need on the air for your typical operating day? If you mostly operate single sideband and FT8, you really don't need a $5,000 rig or a $4,000 rig. Maybe you want one, but you don't really need that. But then if you do have an option to say spend the first $500 or something, consider your antenna, but it may be limited by an HOA, or maybe the family says, well, I want it to be invisible. What makes it difficult? So just have to make decisions on what makes sense for you. So what's changed in 10 years? Well, there's lots of lab numbers from the league and myself. The receivers are phenomenal, but the interface, the user interface, how you interface to the radio with the computer or LCD screen or whatever, it's all over the map. And I consider every radio today an SDR. It's a term that used to sort of mean, well, I run it with the computer, but now every radio's got computer in it, software in it. So the term SDR really doesn't tell you anything anymore other than that we have a lot of flexibility. So how do you interface with the radio? Is it a standalone box? Does it need a computer? Does it have a small LCD screen in comparison to what your computer has? Or do you have a bunch of large screen LCD screens, which a lot of the radios will support? That's totally up to you. Does your radio mostly have knobs and buttons, or is everything touchscreen and a mouse? So this is just so different, and it's just what works for you. And really a band scope, almost everything in the last 7 years has a band scope, and you may or may not need that. If you're just rag chewing, you probably don't care. If you're a contester running what we call search and pounce like I do, very important. So how old is your current rig? If it's more than 10 years, it's a new experience. So we've got several general types of radios today. A superhet, of course, that's been around forever. A hybrid superhet, which means it had a direct sampling scope. And then we've got direct sampling radios, and we'll look at those in detail. And then a term that is fairly new, probably won't catch on, but Dr. Ulrich Roda, he says IF direct sampling, and I'll explain that. So I would say the typical example of a hybrid would be the TS890S, and I had one of those for several years, very nice radio. And this IF direct sampling is what all the brand new Yaesus that have come out in the last 5 years. So they're kind of off in their own little niche. Actually, the only major brand right now that doesn't have a direct sampling of some type is Kenwood, but everyone else has it in some way or other. So does the architecture matter? In other words, what's inside the box? Most of the time it does not. A superhead has a roofing filter and an IF of anywhere from 5 megahertz to 70 megahertz. And you don't really care where the frequency is, but that's what follows the first conversion. And then the hybrid superhet has a direct sampling band scope, but the radio is a superhet. And this term that I say is new, IF direct sampling, we still have roofing filters, but then once you've hit the IF, there's where the audio to digital converter or analog to digital converter occurs at the IF. So pure direct sampling only do not have roofing filters by definition. Probably doesn't matter most of the time unless you've got local signals that are like 60/9 or of course field day or something like that. So what architectures are dominant today? So let's just look at the superhet. We're not talking about something from the 60s, but a TS590 or an ICOM 7100. And the hybrid superhet, well, I think really the only one that's exactly that definition today would be the TS890S. In other words, superhet, direct sampling scope. And this new term, IF direct sampling would apply to all the new Yaesu products, the 101D, the 101MP, or the FTDX10. And then direct sampling, and I'll show you 7 of those in a moment, but the K4D, for an example, the 7610, and all the Flex 6000 series. So those are the pure direct sampling. So any type of direct sampling has to have this ADC chip, the analog to digital converter, in the receive path. Only the IF direct sampling have roofing filters, which will be an advantage in really difficult environments. But all but the superheads have an ADC someplace in the radio. So what limits reception? Well, the receivers are so phenomenal today, but if the interference is in your passband, you can't get rid of that. And that could be key clicks, which unfortunately are more common than you'd like, or splatter on sideband. If you've got a strong signal 3 to 5 kilohertz away from you, and that splatters in your passband, this perfect radio can't get rid of it. Now, if you've got signals that are line of sight, transmit composite noise can be an issue. In that case, the signals are probably S9 plus, 50 or 60 over. And field day would probably be the worst case because we've got all these rigs within a diameter of 1,000 feet. So the choice of the radio for field day, for instance, is very important, that you don't want one that puts out a lot of noise. So besides field day, well, hams that do multi-multi or multi-2 would be prime cases where a roofing filter is an asset. So the challenge cleans transmitters. Well, since we all share the bands, we would hope that the OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, would improve the transmitters. This is something that hasn't changed much in 30 or 40 years. Because we're all using our receiver and realizing whether it's doing a good job or not, the improvements in receive performance in the last 10 or more years is tremendous, but not much has changed in the way of the transmitters. Now, does the typical ham care if his signal has bad key clicks or splatters or has transmit composite noise? He should, but you say, well, I don't care, I'm not hearing it. But everybody else out there, you have to deal with what they're transmitting. So we would hope that all of us would get better over time as the OEMs improve things. So what's new when comparing rigs for my website and my QTH, where I am right now out in the country? So for the last 17 years, I've added on-air observations to my long-form reports to augment what's on the lab, on the website, or in my reports. So let's take a couple of examples here. So this is one of my 3 operating positions. I have more than one because I'm often evaluating a new radio. For instance, the FTDX10 and the FT710. I ran those for 3 months at operating position 1 and 2, so I could really get a handle on it. And I ran contests, brag chewing, you name it. Here's my antenna farm. So I really do emphasize, if you can improve your antenna, do that first. So let's look at some contesting screenshots. You can learn how to set up your radio the best way possible. I want to really emphasize that a preamp and attenuator is the tool. Very important to know when to use it, but you don't just turn them on and leave it on all the time. So the default is not the preamp on and it's not the attenuator on. So let's look at some 10 meter and 160 meter examples. So this was December 2018. I was running a TS890S, and it was the ARRL 10 meter and Saturday afternoon. So what do we see on this screen capture? Well, on the upper right-hand corner, I've got the preamp on. It's 10 meters. Now this was pretty much at the bottom of the sunspot cycle. So there were 20 stations or more in a 10 kilohertz span there on the band scope and the waterfall. But their signals are fairly weak. If you look in the lower right-hand corner, I have the audio peak filter, and that can be used either just to reduce noise, which is the way I do it. I don't run it really sharp, but it reduces noise. And if you're in a contest for 10 or 20 hours, noise is really tiring. So I try to reduce noise as much as practical. Here was the week before, the same year, 2018, for the 160 meter CW contest. Again, looking at just 10 kilohertz there on the band scope, more than 30 stations, and look how much stronger they are than the 10 meter example. So lots of things are in this picture that can be useful. So if you look over on the left, instead of the preamp on like I had on the Kenwood, on 10 meters, this is the attenuator is set at 12 dB. I mean, all the rigs today are certainly work on 10 meters and now 6 meters, so they have to be sensitive enough to work on the upper HF bands, but they're way too sensitive on the low bands. So there's no point in having band noise reading S7 on the S meter, for instance. So in this case, I was running 12 dB. In the upper middle, you can see the audio peak filter was on, just like I did with the Kenwood. And we can look at the signals, and there was more captured there than I really expected. This was just basically to show, look how many signals are in a 10 kilohertz swath. But look what we see on the left, where it says key clicks 5x. The signal, as you can see on the band scope, is quite wide, and on the waterfall, it's quite wide. But then we look over at the right where it says clean. That signal's 3 dB weaker, totally insignificant. But look how narrow that signal is on the band scope and really obvious on the waterfall. It's just nice key click free signal. And then let's look back at the one on the left. If you can see there on the lower down on that key click pattern from that guy's signal, which is bad, there's a little tiny signal trying to peek through the guy's key click, so it'd be harder to copy that guy. And you can see that little signal on the band scope, and you can see the little signal in the waterfall deading away. So we really don't want to have a signal that's 5 times as wide as the other guys. Now, one thing I want to comment on this attenuation, which probably a lot of people don't do. Now, I find that if I'm just on the air in a reg sheet, it probably doesn't make any difference. But if I'm on the air for hours and hours in a contest or trying to work a de-expedition, I like to reduce noise fatigue. So one year, I had, in most of my contest run evaluations are in the fall to early spring, I didn't have anything new like like the Kenwoods that like the Yaesus that I've been using for about a year and a half. Well, I had a 7300 and a TS990, and the vast difference in size and price and the size of the screen, for instance. Well, to compare the two, while you can use an RF gain, I like to have a known attenuation on 160 meters, so I just know exactly what I'm doing. So the ICOM 7300 only has one 20 dB attenuator. So then to make it fair, I ran the TS990S with its 18 dB attenuator for the whole contest. And this was, I'd never done that to that extent. I always just ran 12, but actually I liked it a lot because as I was doing a search and pounce operation, I'd be working a station, tune into the next station, and in between all those signals, there's band noise. But because I had so much attenuation, the band noise was almost out of the picture. Now, I did have to turn the AF gain, the audio gain, up every once in a while, like maybe 2 or 3% of the time, because look at all those signals. They're way above the AGC threshold. But so that was the trade-off, a little more requirement to turn the audio up, but the noise was so much reduced that it was very low fatigue, and I just loved doing that. That was the first time I'd carried it to that extent. Okay, so we looked at key clicks, and they can be wide and annoying. The sideband has the same problem. So here's a couple of screen captures that were done in Boulder, Colorado of a 75 meter QSO that I join on the weekends. And this is to show the difference between a typical signal today. As I mentioned, the transmitters really haven't improved unless they have something special. So we see the station that's there in the waterfall that's narrow was running an Apache 200D with pure signal, which is a software solution to reduce distortion products, in other words, splatter. So today, what are our options? Well, Class A used to be offered by Yaesu but the current 101 MP, for instance, does not have that. So Class A is gone. ICOM now is offered since Thanksgiving, unofficially, because it's really only officially available in Japan. They have digital pre-distortion, so that is a big improvement. Well, Flex has been talking about pre-distortion for 10 years, and the K4 Elecraft company has been talking about it for about 5. But so far, we've got Apache with pure signal for 10 years, and now ICOM is now just has an option there too. So they'll look at the bottom of this waterfall, and there's my Kenwood TS890S, and you can see I have splatter sidebands because we're strong. We're looking at like the signal is about 30/9. But then look above it where the gentleman with the pure signal pre-distortion, his signal is almost just a pure rectangle. You can even see little RFI, probably from a switching power supply in some neighbor who was receiving this signal. On the right-hand edge, you can see that wobbly little signal. You can't even hardly see it when I was talking. So that's unfortunate. So here's what's changed. Now, in this case, I'm using an ICOM with this new digital pre-distortion. And that's me in the upper portion of the waterfall. And you can see there's very little splatter. And then down below, again, another station in Colorado, 30/9, both of us were. And that happened to be a Flex 6700 driving a Power Genius. And there you can see the splatter sideband. So this is what's possible today, to have cleaner signals with what we call pre-distortion. It's like inverse distortion. You correct for the distortion in the transmitter and or the exciter and or the amplifier. And there's one way to look at it, just with us sampling a signal for like 15 seconds. This happened to be, I was transmitting on one ICOM, receiving on another with an antenna 800 feet away. And you can see most of the signal is pretty much straight up and down. So is it a time for a new rig in your shack? So there's lots of great choices if you operate contests or DX pileups. In general, I'd say if you rag chew and operate FT8, what you have now may be just fine. You're not stressing your radio. But then the more current radios, they have a built-in sound card. So making WSJT or the other digital modes operators so much easier than it was 10 or 15 years ago. Here's some information from my website. If you've ever been there, it lists, well, there's over 150 receivers and transceivers on the website with laboratory data. Now, this is not the first 1 through 25 because there's duplicates. For instance, the K3 came out in 2008 or maybe really late 2007. The K3S came out. The direct sampling radios have more variability from sample to sample, not because of the box, but because of the individual ADC chip, the analog to digital converter chip. So there's just a little more difference. So there'll be a second sample for a lot of the direct sampling radios. So this is the top 25. And of those 25, I've run 20 of those rigs in a contest, at least one. And as I say, I was spent 3 months running the new Yaesu, so get a lot of time on the air. But look what you can see there. Right in the middle is a 100 dB radio. 20 years ago, you couldn't buy a 100 dB radio. So the choices today are astounding, from 110, and you said, do I really need 110? Probably not. Clear down to little KX2 at 86, amazing little radio. So your choices are unbelievable, and the prices are all over the map, from $900 to over $12,000. So the sky's the limit. So how are you going to pick a new radio? Well, I'd say, why don't you just pick something out of the top 25? If you've been with an individual brand and you say, I'm an ICOM guy or Yaesu guy or whatever, fine. Every major OEM has a great radio from the standpoint of laboratory numbers, so pick one that fits your budget. As I say, the price range is all over the map. What is really different is the ergonomics, the user interface, the menus, So it's very subjective. What works for you maybe it doesn't work for me, or maybe what you like, I don't. So you just really, if you can sit down in front of a radio, that'd be a great advantage. If you like ham radio outlet, of course, we've only got about 10 of those stores around. Luckily, we have one in Denver. The other thing is, in an urban environment, noise is a big problem. When I moved to Denver in 1969, noise just wasn't an issue. Now everything's electronic, making a racket. So the noise mitigation may be a big deal in an urban environment. You might pick a radio that has what's got the best noise blanking or noise reduction. And that's subjective, of course. And your noise isn't going to be the same as my noise. Again, antennas are important. Here's the list that I consider of importance. Location. Now, you're probably not going to move. I did. Antennas. Emphasize your antenna if you can. Operator skill. I need more CW skill. And then the radio. I'm not saying the radio is not important, but consider what's the most improvement for the least money. Maybe it's a better antenna. Okay, this is going to get kind of techie nerd. This is the 7 direct sampling radios as examples of how they're different and how you need to understand what your radio is compared to another. So if we look at the right-hand column, we've got the dynamic range. And dynamic range means, can you work a really weak signal surrounded by strong signals? And that's the ability of the radio to not produce its own interference. So these numbers are all pretty much around 100 dB, which is phenomenal. Now the thing is that all the direct sampling radios that have an analog to digital converter chip, it's too noisy to just use by itself. Now it would work on 80 or 160, but if we're on 10 meters, let alone 6 meters, you've got to have gain ahead of the ADC chip. And the amount of gain, exclusive of a preamp that would be adjustable, is all over the map, but depending on which company decided to make their standard. So for instance, with the Flex, the noise floor, that would be a CW noise floor measurement with no preamp. Of course, they've got plenty of preamps, but just the way it is fairly insensitive, with a noise floor about equal to band noise on 20 meters. But of course, you can turn a preamp on. The Elecraft has about 10 dB more gain without a preamp than the Flex. And then look at the ICOM, has like 12 dB more gain than the K4. So the noise floor, or consider it sensitivity in another term. Sensitivity I use for sideband, noise floor for CW. That they're 22 dB difference in how the radios are without a preamp. So you just have to realize your radio may be totally different on what's appropriate. So if I'm on 20 meters with a Flex, I'm going to need a preamp. At the same time with an ICOM, I would never use the preamp, but I need to use the attenuator on the low bands because it's way too sensitive. So this is just, they're different. They're not right or wrong. They're just the design that came out of the factory. So current offerings. This is totally subjective on several transceivers that are relatively in the last few years. So this would be observations made here at my QTH where I am right now during contests and just general operating. So the main architecture types, to remind you, hybrid superhet, direct sampling, or the ones that have still a superhet, but they're a direct sampling once we hit the first IF. The most user interface today are some sort of an LCD screen, either internal or a separate screen. I just use the internal ones for all of them, but some people have 2 or 3 enormous screens, and that's great, whatever you like. Now the Flex radios run on Windows or Apple. The Apache that has the pure signal, it runs on Windows only, except their newest offering is called a G2, Generation 2, and it runs on a Raspberry Pi. So that's different than what we've had it until just recently. One thing I find that's annoying, if I'm running my radio with a computer and Windows in particular, is Windows updates can break things. So in other words, it'll be working fine, and then the update comes along and suddenly I go to FT8 and it doesn't work. So the other complication is Windows, or even the Apple OS, is not a real-time operating system. So you might be on the air and your computer decides to go run a scan of your hard drive or go out and update your antivirus program. So this can be an issue. The other radios are standalone and they don't have that issue. But how you interface is up to you, but you might consider having just a separate computer if you're running a computer operated rig just for your radio. So let's look at what's available today, and that's come out since 2020. And the top half of these were in that time period. The price range is all over the map. The K4D with a tuner, because almost everyone has a tuner, that's an option in the K4D or the K4, it's almost $6,500. And then we've got sort of bargains today. Look at the Yaesu FTDX10, $1,400. The ICOM 705, $1,350. The little Yaesu 710, two versions of it, with or without an external speaker, $900 to $1,000. So the bargains today are amazing. And then, of course, there's the used market. So then the other ones on the list are the other more flagship radios, and they're in the $3,000 to $4,000 range. So let's make some comments on individual brands or models. Flex has had some military contracts, and of course they really started with the 6700, which was a spinoff of a military contract. So they've been busy with that for the last 5 years or so, and also emphasizing remote operation and contesting. There hasn't been a lot of digital signal processing changes at Flex in that time period due to their military contracts, and there are some bugs that have been around a long time, but the Flex has a very loyal customer base. There's no documentation though, so you can't get a schematic or a service manual, and that I find annoying. I'd like to at least look at the schematic. Currently, they've got radios that are M and non-M. In other words, the M model has a built-in display and knobs and all that. So the non-M models are shipping now again. The M models will ship this summer, according to Steve Hicks. And then the Maestro actually should have just started shipping again this week. And they said it'd take a few months to fill the backlog. So they've had to catch up due to supply chain problems. Apache, that's probably the smaller of the big six. They have the best noise mitigation, noise blanking and noise reduction. And it's one of two brands that have this pre-distortion to reduce splatter. But I consider the Apache a fiddler's delight. It's not plug and play. So if, let's say you just recently passed your general, or maybe you're even operating as a tech on 10 meters, and you want an HF rig, I don't suggest the Apache for your first rig, and I also don't suggest QRP for your first rig. Buy a 100-watt standalone radio that just needs power, a microphone, a key, and an antenna. The documentation on all the adjustments in the user interface on all the menus is rather incomplete. Some I have the slightest idea what they do on the Apache. One company in Australia makes the radio and they write no software. It's all open source. Warren Pratt, NR0B, who lives about an hour from me, writes all the DSP code, including the pure signal. And a separate computer may be a good choice. Comments on the 7300. Now, I consider that a game changer, not because it was the best radio ever made, but it changed the direct sampling world 8 years ago. It was the first time you could get direct sampling in a box with knobs, and you just plugged it in and it worked. You undoubtedly know that if you get on the air and rag chew that you're going to talk to a 7300. There's over 50,000 sold just in the United States and Canada. It's got a good dynamic range, just a hair below 100. The 7300 operates much like the more expensive 7610. The ergonomics are good. The scope is small. One thing with the ICOM is they have a common interface. They're not exactly the same, but the 7300, the 7610, the 9700, which is the VHF UHF version, that's and the 705, they all work about the same way. So about 2 years ago, ICOM improved the scope, with something called a scrolling feature. So when you're tuning to work the next station in a contest, for example, you use a cursor so the screen doesn't smear when you tune it. Without the scrolling feature, I found the waterfall almost useless. But since they added that 2 years ago, it's just fantastic. Firmware is stable, but the 7300 does not have an audio peak filter like I explained with the Kenwood and the 7610. The latest firmware is 1.42, but that has something to do with the PW2 amplifier that hasn't shipped in the US yet. So if you have a 7300, I wouldn't bother trying to update the firmware. No point at the moment. Wait till we know more what's going on there. Comments on the Yaesu FT710. This is Yaesu's first pure direct sampling transceiver. It's similar to the 7300, but the lab numbers are better, and you would hope so. It came out 7 years after the 7300. So here's what your options are. On the 710 AES, it has an external speaker. Now I like the external speaker, but I don't like mixing the internal speaker with the external speaker. There is a panning adjustment, so I just pan it all the way to the external speaker, but that's up to you. The 710 Field doesn't come with the extra speaker, and it's $100 cheaper. If you use headphones all the time, why not save $100? The 7300 is still $1,000, and the FTDX10, which is the super het with direct sampling at the IF, $1,400. Probably for a CW pileup operator, I'd pick the 10. The user interface and the band scope, I wish that was a little more refined, but you get used to it. I spent the fourth quarter of 2022 running contests with both the 710 and the 10. I tore down the rigs at operating position 1 and 2 and ran the Yaesus for all that entire 3 months. CQ Worldwide CW and the AWL contest, the 160 and the 10 meters, and it really spans the gamut from low frequency noisy bands to quieter bands with a longer skip. The FTDX10 came out before the 710. Excellent lab numbers, hardly anything different from the 101D. The ergonomics are different than the 710. Again, the user interface to me is a little clumsy, but you get used to it. So the 10 is that IF direct sampling. In other words, it's a super het with roofing filters, but as soon as we hit the first IF at 9 megahertz, we're ADC direct sampling. Both the 710 and the 10 have an audio peak filter. The 7300 does not. So like I say, I ran all these contests over that 3 months, including Stu Perry, top band 160, and I only ran the 10 because it was easier to adjust the CW bandwidth with just a knob. So sitting in front of the FTDX10 and the FT710, it's almost like they were designed and manufactured by different companies. Adjusting the filter bandwidth in the IF shift is easy in the 10, dual concentric knobs, not so flexible in the 710. The 10 has the volume control very close to the VFO on the left side of the VFO, and so if you're right-handed, you tend to bump the VFO adjusting the volume, but of course you can get used to it. The 710 has less crowded buttons, and it has some of the buttons on the top edge, so its ergonomics as far as just pushing buttons is a little simpler on the 710. Unfortunately, if you're using a fairly narrow span, like in my examples of 10 kilohertz for a contest, I want to be able to work every station in that 10 kilohertz and then go on to the next 10 kilohertz and have it recenter the band scope, but it does not on the Yaesus. So I found that was a time waster. The Kenwood TS590, that used to be the best bang for the buck when the 590S came out in 2010, and then 4 years later the SG came out. It's an excellent radio. It has no band scope. Not that you can't add one, but that's the sort of the transition was that time period. Reasonable price, used market even better, very easy user interface, not too complicated. I've operated both the S and the SG in 160 meter contests, and I believe it was when I was running the S, I also ran the 10-Tech Eagle at the same time. So in that case, I had two different radios I was evaluating at operating position 1 and 2. Will Kenwood bring out a new rig in 2024? I wish I knew that. The 590SG came out in 2014. The 890S, which is an excellent radio, I owned it for several years, came in 2018, so it's good. Time's ticking away. I really like the waterfall best of the 890S over anything else, but I do like the ICOM. It's just a hair below as far as efficiency. The TS2000 was discontinued, and that was its sort of DC light radio. It's 160 meters through 70 centimeters, or with an option 23 centimeters. So it got discontinued several years ago, but with no replacement. Last year at Hamvention, the new walkie-talkie from Kenwood came out, the THD75A. I don't know much difference between the 75 and the 74, but it's very popular. So whatever happened to the competitors to the 7300, the 9700, since the 2000's gone, I don't know. 10 watts in a battery, summits and parks on the air. Do you like to do that? Do you work them from your home station, or do you like to go out in the field? So if it does interest you, one rig to consider, assuming you don't want a 100-watt rig with a big battery, it would be the ICOM 705. It works 160 meters through 70 centimeters, sideband, CW, FM, digital FT8 with a laptop, of course, and the price is reasonable. It also has an optional tuner that runs on batteries with locking relays. That's $360, and you could just have a 23-foot piece of wire, throw the wire up into a tree at a park or someplace, and work 40 meters through 6 meters with the touch of a button. I worked a 705 that was running Parks on the Air in the Colorado mountains, New Year's Day of 2023. The guy was S9, 2-meter sideband, and it was 100 miles away, and it was just like he was sitting in the room. It was tremendous. So here's what the 705 looks like. It only weighs about 2.4 pounds. The 7300 by comparison is just a little under 10 pounds. And it's even got a speaker in the front pointing right at you. So it's a quite very nice radio, and I've run it in a couple of contests. So comments on the 705. It's a 5-watt radio with the internal battery and a 10-watt radio with an external battery. It operates pretty much like a 7300. Of course, there's all sorts of things that it has, like D-Star, that I don't use. But if you can run a 7300, you can run a 705 with your blindfolded. Lots of VHF features. The screen size is the same as like on a 7300. And it's like I said, the interface is the same. All the current ICOMs pretty much work the same as far as the user interface. And it does recenter. So if I've got it set up for the contest that I ran in 2020, the ARRL 160, ARRL 10 meters, to whatever span I chose at a given mode or how active the band was. Once I've covered every station that I'm doing search and pounce, I go to the next swath, it recenters all by itself. Really nice. Comments on the K4. Much of the firmware that ran the K3 got ported to the K4. In the last 2 years, they've made significant strides in their firmware. When they first shipped, it was a mess. So the firmware and features are still under development. You might go to some feature like general coverage and it says not implemented yet. And every time a beta software, beta means test software, and once it's out for the general public to play with and to find bugs, there's bugs. The AGC threshold is still kind of strange. And matter of fact, Wayne just said yesterday that they're going to make an improvement in that. That's because the audio level is sometimes inadequate, but maybe this new update will fix that. Of the excluding the $10,000 rigs, the K4D is the most expensive mainstream rig. As I said, it's almost $6,500, where most everything else is in the $3,000 range or below $2,000. There was a price increase of April 20th of 2023, but there's discounts at a lot of festivals. Maybe there will be today. The HD model, which would be a super het, would be like the direct sampling at the IF. Hasn't been out yet, although it's in development. Pre-distortion has been talked about, but still not available. And the transverters. So there's things to come for the K4. The customer base is likely mostly past K3 owners, very brand loyal, tremendous support, and also N6 TV Bob, tremendous support on the reflector. The only thing that's really odd about the K4D or the K4, if you've only got a single antenna, let's say you've just got a tri-bander 10, 15, and 20. Well, let's say your working station's on 20, but you want to see if 10 meters is open. You can't do that with one antenna. That's just odd. But that's the way it is, because the transmit low-pass filters in the circuit on 20 meters, and you're trying to listen to 10 through the low-pass filter, it doesn't work. Comments on the 7610 versus the 7300. Well, the 7610 now does have digital pre-distortion. It came out Thanksgiving Day last year. The difference is people who send me emails or call me up on the phone, should I upgrade from the 7300? So what's the difference? There are no noisy relays for the TR switching or the amp key line. And there is a relay for that, but it's an option. You can use a FET. It does have an audio peak filter. The 7300 does not. It's got dual receivers, of course. So for DXpeditions split, every DXpedition runs split. It's handy, not required. You can certainly work split with the 7300, but it's easier. Many more physical buttons and a larger LCD screen. There's a button for each band instead of having used the touch screen. There's 2 transmit ports on the 7610 versus 1. It has a receive-only port for like a beverage. It does have a video output. If you want to put a 47-inch monitor on it, you can. The fan is quieter, no question. The second receiver is really only easy to use with their RC28 external tuning knob. It's kind of expensive, but the flex knob is expensive, and the Elecraft knob is expensive. They all cost about $300. So this firmware update from Thanksgiving 1.40 added this digital pre-distortion, and it works. Now at the moment, nobody knows how to make it work with an external amp, but I'm running tube amps, and the improvement is dramatic. If you only work sideband and FT8, it'd be hard to argue, other than the fact that you'd like new radios. The 7300 works just fine. The 7610 costs 2.5 times as much. This is just a quick look at using the split for a contest. This was the Swains Island. I was on 12 meters, and so I was able to be seeing the transmit frequency range and the receive range. This was the Timor East with the 7610, and again, using the split double receivers. So important factors to consider. Don't select a radio on one number. That's the thing that I've sort of created this monster. All these 150 radios are listed by close in dynamic range, which is important. It's not the only thing. So if you've got operator fatigue from noise or AGC that doesn't work right, that's annoying. Noise reduction and noise blanking could be very important to you. I would say for remote operation, which is now being more and more popular because it's so noisy in an urban environment, Flex may be the best for that. It does, though, have to connect through a server, and occasionally that goes down. As far as Apache has pure signal and some amazing noise blanking. Usually in a contest, you can't use a noise blanker because it false triggers. Not so with the spectral noise blanker in the Apache. Both require either an internal computer or an external one. And the ICOM digital pre-distortion, we don't know how to run it with an external amp at this time. Other things to consider. bad ergonomics, or at least ones that don't work for you, can be frustrating. Does the speech processor work? Well, for instance, when the K4 shipped, speech processor didn't work. EQ didn't work, but that's been fixed. Do you want a standalone radio, or do you want to run it with a computer? Personally, I want a standalone radio, but that's just me. Is the firmware updated? I mean, all these radios can update firmware, but if they don't bring out any new updates, fix bugs, or add new features, then that's sort of too bad. What about warranty service? This can be a big deal. Everything's surface mount components. I can't even see them without a magnifying glass. For instance, Kenwood used to have two facilities, and one was in Virginia that was really good. That got closed down. The one in California was terrible. And so that was a big problem. Well, they eventually fired that company. They have a new company in New York. It's been out a couple of years now. Does a very good job. So warranty service is important. Is your radio supported with parts and service when it's out of production? And that's sort of a question mark for the K3, because obviously the K4 is announced 5 years ago. So parts for a K3 may be an issue. And the bottom line, do you enjoy using your radio? This is a hobby. It's supposed to be fun. And so if your radio is a struggle, try something else. And something that you like or your friend likes may not work for you. So it's just very subjective. I'll send your club a PDF of this. If anyone wants a copy of that, they can also email me, rob@nc0b.com. I'm going to quit sharing and see if we have any questions. So those of you in the audience, hello, and fire away if you have anything you want to ask. Do we have a moderator?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Anybody out there, wave your hand.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me from back here?
Yes, I can.
On Flex, the Flex iPad software is like operating a radio.
Yes.
Can you justify spending $1,500 for the Maestro when the iPad seems to be just fine?
Well, it's pretty expensive considering it costs more than the ICOM 7300 or the FTDX 10 or et cetera, et cetera. So it seems kind of expensive. It's been out of production now for a long time, but they're just shipping it again. So that's just personal. But a lot of people are very happy with the iPad interface.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Is there anybody online that has any questions?
Yeah, just unmute if you do.
I have a question.
Yep, go ahead.
I'm just starting, and I'm about to buy my first radio, for its W and SP. I definitely want to operate, 10 meters down. Is there something you want to recommend so that I don't spend a fortune on my first radio and hate it?
Okay, well, that's an important question. I don't think anyone who's new to the hobby should go spend $4,000 or $5,000 for their first radio. Hopefully you're going to be a ham operator for the next 10 or 20 years. So I would stay in that price range below 2,000, and really there's nothing between, as far as I know, between 1,400 and 2,000 out there right now that's brand new. So I would say look at those radios that were on the list that were between $900 and $1,400. And they all work really well. They're different from the user interface. That's the biggest thing I can't underestimate is the way that the user interface and the menus and the adjustability and the knobs and all that, or whether you have to go into a menu to make a simple adjustment, is very much different. So if you're considering a radio, and I would get something between $900 and $1,400, is if you can find a friend or someone in your club, if you do happen to have an HRO nearby, make use of that, because it's very subjective and it's very personal as to what's going to make sense. But those radios I talked about today in that price range, you can't go wrong. They're just going to operate differently, but you won't say, I missed that DX because the radio didn't work. That's not the case.
Rob, could you give us the URL for your website?
Sure, it's real simple. There's a couple, but the easy one is NC0B.com. NC0B.com will get you there. And if you want to send an email, rob@nc0b.com.
Any other questions?
Okay, very good. We'll enjoy the rest of the HamCon, and we'll let the next presenter connect in and go from there. 73, everyone. Thanks for attending.
Thank you.